So hopefully you've already watched the video and have got notes on Somerset's religious policy, and now we're going to have a little look at how radical the religious changes under Northumberland were. So although it might be expected that the unrest in the summer of 1549 would dampen government moves towards Protestantism, this was far from the case. Perhaps the government thought that, having defeated the rebels, there would be little opposition to further change. However, it must not be forgotten that through the late autumn of 1549 and the early winter of 1549 to 50, the triumph of Protestantism was not a foregone conclusion. There was factional struggle in the council between reformists and Catholics. The outcome of this was not certain. It was only when Northumberland's triumph in 1550 arrived that further Protestant moves could be made. So what did Northumberland's Protestantism look like? The religious direction became apparent with the new ordinal in January 1550, which revised the procedure for the ordination of priests. However, this did not satisfy Hooper. Hooper was annoyed by the swearing of an oath to saints and the need to wear a surplice. It resulted in a battle with Ridley and Cranmer that led to Hooper declining the post of Bishop of Gloucester and being imprisoned for failure to stop preaching. In the end, a compromise was reached and Hooper took up his post, but it highlights the difficulties in implementing these religious changes and the divisions amongst key religious leaders. An interesting insight is offered here in a letter to John Calvin, and he claimed that the bishops have not yet agreed on Christian doctrine, let alone the rules of the church, and very few parishes have qualified clergymen. He later goes on to say, though Parliament meets every year, the number of secular matters stops church affairs being discussed. So this highlights the fact that the ongoing social and economic are probably more significant or predominant in terms of discussions when Parliament meet. And that's really important in offering us a clear contextual understanding of the period. One of the most obvious difficulties in imposing religious changes could be seen in the campaign against images in the church. This campaign had seen efforts earlier to remove them. In 1547, royal injunctions ordered the removal of superstitious images. In February 1548, all images were to be removed, and in December 1549, a proclamation ordered the destruction of the remainder of all images. But an act for abolishing and putting away of images and various books was passed by Parliament in 1550. And the evidence from Parliament shows Parliament condemning Catholic service books. And it says, the King has issued through Parliament a uniform, quietly and godly order of service called the Book of Common Prayer, which contains nothing but the very pure Word of God. However, alongside it are still practised corrupt, untrue and superstitious ceremonies, which allow some to attack the order and meaning of the prayer book and encourage great diversity of opinion. Therefore, it is ordered that all books used for the old Mass be abolished, and any images of stone, timber or marble be defaced and destroyed. So you can see the reluctance there from the population and the clergy to follow the previous injunctions and proclamations regarding images in the church, and this had to be addressed again in 1550 by Edward. Northumberland further strengthened his grip on power in 1551, and this allowed further religious changes to take place. Conservative bishops, e.g. Gardiner, were deprived of their sees, and this gave the reformists a majority among the bishops. Therefore, when Parliament met in January 1552, the government was able to embark on a large-scale programme of Protestant reform. A new Treason Act was introduced, which made it an offence to question the royal supremacy or any beliefs of the Church. This was followed in March by a second Act of Uniformity. And I've just got a source to read you, which is an Act of Parliament in 1552, and it highlights some of the problems and maybe why a second Act of Uniformity was needed. And it says, in spite of the introduction of the first Common Book of Prayer by Parliament, a great number of people in this realm wilfully and damnably refused to come to their parish churches on Sundays and holy days. In future, those who are absent shall be punished by the church courts. So arguably, the initial religious settlements were quite limited. The most noticeable move towards Protestantism came with the second prayer book. This became the basis for church service and had to be used. According to Ronald Hutton, the new service was introduced in every parish where churchwarden accounts survive within the given time frame. However, although it was being enforced, we need to be aware that this does not necessarily mean that everyone agreed with it or accepted the views that it contained. So it's worth thinking about the contextual situation around their religious policies. In the case of Somerset and Northumberland, what were their religious policies motivated or driven by? And also to consider how Protestant had England become under Northumberland. And you might want to do a comparison in your notes about the extent it had become Protestant and compare that to post-break with Rome England under Henry VIII. So thinking to the extent that England was a Protestant country by 1553, there is much debate amongst historians about the extent of changes and the impact at grassroots level. It must always be remembered that Edward ruled for only 6 years, and given the lack of popular support for Protestantism at his accession, how far was it really possible to change a nation's beliefs in such a short period? Some historians have argued that there were steady but slow moves towards Protestantism throughout the period, but major moves were only brought in during the last few months, with the second prayer book, an Act of Uniformity, along with 42 articles. Moreover, all of these would have had little time to make an impact. Supporters of this interpretation could even point to the fact that the 42 articles never became law because of Edward's death. However, compared with the situation in 1547, the Church had changed a great deal, not only to the influence of the two Lord Protectors, but the influence of Protestant bishops, as well as overseas theologians such as Martin Bucer, who had come to the country. There is little doubt that officially England was a Protestant nation. Churchwardens' accounts suggest that reforms had been carried out. Churches had been changed, altars had been replaced with communion tables, and the new service was being used in every parish, for which churchwarden accounts have survived. However, we have also seen that imposing the changes were not always an easy process. For example, the struggle to remove images. Given this difficulty, it is perhaps even harder to judge the extent to which the changes were embraced at local level. Perhaps the most difficult element for historians is judging the extent of which the ordinary people of England welcomed the Protestant religion. There were some parishes where the changes were welcomed, but in many instances it appears that the changes were grudgingly accepted. And Eamon Duffy judges it as used to obedience. Many of them accepted the changes, however unwelcome, as unavoidable. However, Duffy also notes that constant exposure over time to Cranmer's prayer book must have had some impact, meaning that nothing would ever have been the same again. Haig's interpretation is quite interesting. It says, if it be asked why they got them in terms of the religious changes, the answer is that they were forced to conform. The machinery of coercion and supervision deployed by the government was so effective that for most parishes passive resistance was simply not an option. So suggesting really that the government were very good at implementing and successful at implementing the religious changes. It's just whether in your own mind you regard it as successful if the people are abiding by these changes rather than actually accepting them. And this idea is supported by David Lowes, who argues that Protestantism was not a natural growth, it was highly artificial and imposed by authority. Nevertheless, it was successfully imposed. It might also be suggested that the number of religious changes brought in since the break with Rome had left many either confused or religiously indifferent. They accepted the changes because they were told to do so, but did not fully welcome them or oppose them. This seems to have been the case among many of the ordinary clergy who served under both Henry VIII and Edward, and would continue under Mary, but it also seems to be true of many of the population. The only area where there is evidence of the new religion being welcomed is in England and some of the southern counties, such as East Anglia. The Prayer Book Rebellion was the exception in terms of the ordinary people accepting the religious changes. Historians have studied wills to try and calculate the extent of support, but this is fraught with difficulties. Such studies have shown great regional variations, with only 8% of the wills in Kent having an obvious Protestant leaning in 1549, but 27% in Suffolk for the whole of Edward's reign. This could be contrasted with both York and the southwest, where there were only 2% before 1550 and only just 1% in the southwest. However, the rapid restoration of Catholicism under Mary might suggest that traditional religion still retained its popularity, making Mary's task that much easier.